The downside for Christina was that when her book was published in 1978, just a year after her mother's death, she was accused of making up stories to get attention or to get a book deal. When the movie came out in 1981 and she finally saw it, and she saw that the producers and director had added additional faked scenes, that just did not help her reputation any.
And as author A. Ashley Hoff, 5 years ago, he published his book, Match Game 101, a backstage history of Match Game, which we've just been talking about. Well, your other book that just came out is With Love, Mommie Dearest, the making of an unintentional camp classic. And it was about the 1981 cult classic, Mommie Dearest. What events inspired you to write the book?
I had basically met Christina Crawford at an event years ago, and long before I ever thought about writing on the subject, and we ended up in a conversation where, she basically acknowledged the fact she does not like the movie, but she nonetheless admitted that its continued popularity, along with her own original memoir, the book version of Mommie Dearest, had helped bring into the national conversation discussions of child abuse, how to get over it, making distinctions between disciplining your child and actual abuse, things like that. And so I always had it in the back of my head that despite the fact that the movie really is an accidental comedy in a lot of ways, just because it's considered a very over-the-top presentation, and Faye Dunaway's performance is considered over the top. Nonetheless, it covers some pretty dark subject matter. And so I pitched this as an idea to my agent, my literary agent. I didn't even think it was the most marketable idea I could come up with. But he came right back to me and said, I already know 3 or 4 editors I could pitch this to off the top of my head. And so I started writing it. I already knew a number of people who were connected to the film and certainly knew the movie as well as Christina Crawford's original book very well anyway. So it just kind of grew from there, and I basically just tried to answer the question, how did this movie that was, a top-notch production, it had everything going for it. It was an A-list movie star, an A-list director, an A-list budget. It was based on a best-selling book. How did this movie that had so much going for it somehow just completely unravel? And I think I've answered that with the book. And the reviews that I've seen, I haven't gone out of my way to check out all sorts of reviews, but what has been thrown in front of my face has been favorable. So I feel good about that. And I hope people enjoy the book.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I've seen the movie several times myself. And what was interesting in researching a little bit a couple days ago, that the wire hangers was one of the most famous scenes that people remember, yet Christina herself said that never actually happened. Who came up with that part of that fiction, or who came up with that idea of the wire hangers?
Well, Tracy Hotchner was a key screenwriter. Frank Yablans was the producer of the movie, and he had basically, once he had chosen director Frank Perry to work with him, they had basically run through so many different drafts of screenplays, none of which quite worked. Tracy, who was working on another project with Frank Yablans, was charged with writing, trying to adapt Mommie Dearest into a screenplay. And her screenplay is the one that got greenlit by Paramount. So that's the one they worked on. There were a few changes made to her screenplay, but a lot of what she had come up with is what ends up on the screen in the final version that we know. A lot of stuff had to be, it's the same with any biopic. Things are added for dramatic effect that are similar, yet, convey the same message, even if they are not technically, word for word accurate compared to what Christina's book originally said.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the haircutting scene that's in the movie, that never happened. It's a completely fictionalized scene, but it's meant to replace another incident that Christina talks about in her book, where basically she had, as a child, torn some wallpaper in her bedroom, and her mother, in retaliation, had basically taken the pair of scissors and cut apart her favorite dress and made her wear it for a week. And, you know, there's no real way to put that on screen. It does not have the same effect. So they scrapped the real scene from Christina's book in favor of this haircutting scene, which they felt conveyed a similar situation, a similar scenario, even if it was not technically correct. The downside for Christina was that when her book was published in 1978, just a year after her mother's death, she was accused of, you know, making up stories to get attention or to get a book deal. And when the movie came out in 1981 and she finally saw it, and she saw that the producers and director had added additional faked scenes, that just did not help her reputation, Annie, and she was, you know, livid over that, as well as just every other element of the way the movie turned out.
Wow. And I remember you had told me at the Quiz Show Expo that the character that Steve Forrest played, Uncle Greg Savitt, was a composite character of several real-life men in Joan Crawford's life before she married Alfred Steele.
Yeah. The primary figure was entertainment lawyer Greg Boutzer. However, a couple of the scenes, like for instance when Steve Forrest's character breaks up with Faye as Joan, and she, in retaliation, starts cutting out his face from photographs of the two of them together. That was actually based on an incident that happened between Joan Crawford and her second husband, Francho Tone. And so, or no, was it Francho Tone, or was it her second or third husband, Philip Terry? Maybe it was Philip Terry. But so that incident did happen. It just didn't happen with Greg Boutzer. So yeah, Steve Forrest basically was a stand-in for a couple of the men in the real Joan Crawford's life.
It's funny, when I looked at Steve Forrest, I always confused him with Robert Stack because they looked very similar, although their voices were completely different. So I was always
they were both popular television stars at the time too.
Oh yeah,
because Steve Forrest later did SWAT. I think it was called SWAT, SWAT, where he was a police officer, and very popular TV show. And he'd done quite a lot of films. In fact, when you watch something like the showdown scene between Joan Crawford and, as played by Faye Dunaway, and Louis B. Mayer, as played by Howard Da Silva in the movie, you can see in the background this particular photograph of MGM stars that's hanging on the wall. Steve Forrest is actually in that actual photograph because Steve Forrest had been to MGM in the 50s. And, you know, he had been a big Western star, as well as appeared in a lot of other movies, probably B movies at that point. But he'd had a long, steady career.
He did. And how many of the stars did you get to interview? I remember you interviewed Belita Moreno, and you also interviewed Mara Hobel, or is it Mara Hobel, who played young Christina?
Hobel, yeah. Mara and gosh, I was talking with a lot of the people. Ritanya and I had an email exchange. Most of the stuff regarding Ritanya comes from her own book. She had, in 2015, published her on-set diary called The Mommie, which she later published in 2015 as The Mommie Dearest Diary. And there was a lot of stuff that I used in my book or used in reference kind of to figure out which days they shot, that sort of thing. For my own book, I was also very lucky because I was able to talk to a lot of the crew members and production staff members, because nobody ever talks to those people. Mm-hmm. And they're usually the ones with the best stories because they're observing what's going on the set, you know. They're privy to a lot of information, whereas the actors and actresses usually are too in the middle of learning their blocking, rehearsing, or doing the actual shooting, so they don't have as much of an opportunity to look at the big picture, so to speak. But I was lucky because I was able to track down a lot. Michael Edwards, who played the young actor that Faye has a scene with, Uncle Ted as young Mara, as Christina calls him, and some of the other actors and actresses who had smaller roles, but also gave me their insights into what they witnessed on set and what their takeaway was, and their reaction to the finished film.
Yeah, in fact, the film was a $10 million budget, took in $19 million in the U.S. and another $6 million overseas. So even though the initial thought was like, this film's going to flop, it actually did make a little bit of a profit there. Oh,
it was, despite its reputation as being a, cinematic bomb or a huge flop, Mommie Dearest was never a financial failure. It was always very popular with audiences. It made its money back in the first month and did very, very well. And again, today, we're still talking about it 43 years later. You can walk into any retail outlet that sells movies, DVDs or Blu-rays, and the chances are pretty good they'll have a copy of Mommie Dearest in stock. They don't have to special order it. So that's one of the kind of surprises that I came to realize in the writing of this book. I came to realize that success and failure are not necessarily what we think they are. Mommie Dearest considered a critical failure, but nonetheless a financial winner. We should all fail as successfully as Mommie Dearest did.
That is so true, and something a lot of us don't oftentimes ponder, but it's really, it's fascinating. Great wisdom. This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and next time our conversation with author A. Ashley Hoff concludes with more information and insight and some cool stories from his latest book, With Love, Mommie Dearest, the making of an unintentional camp classic.